Last week in chapter 15, we saw uh, God reaffirming his covenant with Abraham, and Abraham's concern that he was still childless, and he was thinking that his servant Eliezer would become his heir. But God gave him the assurance that Eliezer would not become his heir, but Abraham would have a son of his own. And that was the confirmation of the covenant that God made. And we had that ceremony that was performed there with Abraham cutting up the sacrifices, and then that smoking fire pot and the flaming torch passing through the pieces of the sacrifice there to confirm that covenant. And at the end of the chapter, the promise of the extent of the land that God would give Abraham's descendants. So we come into chapter 16 this evening, and we continue on with the story here of the concern regarding the heir that Abraham would have. So chapter 16 deals with the story of Hagar and Ishmael. So we'll read chapter 16 verses 1 to 6, which says, "Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my maid, it may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to Abram. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my maid to your she saw that she had conceived. She looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. Abram has been living in the land of Canaan for 10 years now. He's 85 years old, and Sarai is 75 years old. She's 10 years younger. And despite God's promise of an heir, Sarai is still childless. And the condition of Sarai's childlessness is a cause of great stress for her, and one for which she holds the Lord responsible. In verse 2, she says, The Lord has prevented me from bearing children. And so she proposes a scheme which would enable Abram to have an heir of his own, and which would also give her a family as well. She has an Egyptian maid named Hagar. Hagar is a Hebrew name, so although she's Egyptian, she has a Hebrew name, and Hagar, her name means flight. It might be that Hagar had joined Abram and Sarai after their visit to Egypt back in chapter 12. And Sarai proposes that since the Lord has prevented her from having children, then Abram should take Hagar and have children by her. The promise of a son so far has been made just to Abram, that it would be he who would have a son and descendants. So perhaps Sarai is thinking, well, this is a way in which that promise that God has made could be fulfilled. Hagar is Sarai's property. She's Hagar is her maidservant, so she belongs to Sarai. So she's under her control. So Sarai can do with her as she pleases. So Sarai was in effect telling Abram that since God had not done anything, then they needed to take matters into their own hands and they needed to act. Childlessness was a cause of great embarrassment and shame in the ancient East, and there was a custom by which a wife, if she was unable to have children, could provide her husband with a surrogate wife who would then bear him children. The children would then belong to the principal wife, in this case Sarai. And this is what she says in verse 2, It may be that I shall obtain children by her. So any child born of that relationship would be regarded as being Sarai's child. A similar case happens later in Genesis chapter 30 with Rachel. in chapter 30, verses 3 and 4, Jacob's wife, Rachel, and she too is unable to have children. In chapter 30, verses 3 and 4, Rachel she says to Jacob in verse 1, "Give me children or I shall die." So you see her desperation for having a child. And her solution is similar to Sarai's here in verse 3. She says to Jacob, "Here is my maid Bilhah, go into her that she may bear upon my knees, and even I may have children through her." So again, it's the same sort of situation that Rachel would have a child through Bilhah, that child would be regarded as hers. And then the same situation arises with Leah as well in verses 9 and 10. After Leah ceases bearing children, she's no longer able to have any more children. So in that case, Leah took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, "Good fortune," so she called his name Gad. So we see that Leah is the one who's naming the child there. And then she has a second son, Zilpah has a second son as well, whom Leah names as well as Asher. So this was the custom. If a wife was unable to have children, a maid servant could fulfill that function of providing children for her. And this is what Sarai is proposing should happen here, that Abram should take Hagar. And Hagar would have no say in this matter. She would have to do what was asked of her. So Abram obeyed Sarai then. Sarai gave Abram her maid Hagar to be his wife. Verse 3 there says, Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Hagar's position in the household would then be elevated by becoming Abram's secondary wife. So she would now be under his authority and no longer Sarai's maid, not under Sarai anymore. So Hagar became pregnant then, and when she realized that she was expecting a child, she then began to look with contempt on Sarai, as we see in verses 3 and 4 there. So she begins to look down on Sarah and perhaps regarding herself as being better, that she's been able to produce this child, become pregnant, whereas Sarah has not been able to accomplish that. A similar situation was faced by Hannah as well in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Again, Hannah is another wife who's unable to have children. Elkanah is her husband, and he has another wife, Peninnah. Verse 2 of 1 Samuel chapter 1 says of Elkanah, he had two wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And then we see further on down how Peninnah used to mock Hannah because of her childlessness. Verse 4 says, on the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. And although he loved Hannah, he would give Hannah only one portion, because the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her sorely to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So again, in that family situation, there was conflict and disruption caused by that situation as well for Hannah there. So the same is happening here with Abram and Sarai and Hagar. Sarai then complained to Abram about how she was being treated by Hagar and appealed for his help. She called upon the Lord to judge between them in verse 5 there. She says, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my maid to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. So she is in effect blaming Abram for the situation here and saying, well, may this wrong that's been done to me, may it come back upon you, and let the Lord judge who is right and wrong in this situation. So Abram then responded by telling Sarai that Hagar was her maid and in her power, or in her hand. So he's now returning Hagar to her position as Sarai's maid. So he's really giving her back to him to be her maid once again, placing her under Sarai's control. So he says, do to her as you please. And perhaps this is Abram's way of trying to bring peace to this situation, that he didn't want it to be to cause a problem or to cause this conflict. And so he gives Hagar back to Sarai here. But Sarai then began to deal harshly with Hagar, began to afflict her, so that Hagar then ran away from her. As we see in verse 6, then Sarai dealt harshly with her and she fled from her. So Hagar takes the opportunity then to run away, to get out of that situation. So although Sarai had thought that her proposal, her initial idea would help the situation, it proved to be a mistake, and Abram was in the wrong for going along with it as well. So instead of waiting for God to act, they had become impatient and they took matters into their own hands, which then just caused further problems and troubles for them. It created feelings of pride and resentment and jealousy and strife, injustice and mistreatment between Sarai, Hagar, and Abraham. Reading on to the next part of the story, verses 7 to 14, we go on to read this. Then the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, maid of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your descendants that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, his hand against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, Thou art a God of seeing. For she said, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? Therefore the well was called Beer Lahairoi. It lies between Kadesh and Beret. Hagar fled then, and she was found by the angel of the Lord by a spring of water in the wilderness on the way to Shur. And this is in the direction of Egypt. She's gone south. So Hagar is fleeing towards her homeland. We've been told that she's an Egyptian, so it seems that she is heading back towards her homeland. The angel of the Lord is an interesting character who makes an appearance here, and we'll come across him in several other situations as well. The angel of the Lord is really an appearance of God himself. Angel of the Lord is known as a theophany, God making a visible appearance in this form. As Hagar herself acknowledges in verse 13, she calls his name a God of seeing, and she says, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? So God is making this appearance in the form of the angel of the Lord. The fact that the angel of the Lord found Hagar indicates his care and his concern for her. And he addresses her as Hagar, maid of Sarai. So the angel of the Lord knows who she is. So although mistakes have been made in this situation, God is still concerned and is concerned about the situation, that these matters should be put right. The angel of the Lord then questioned Hagar, asking where she had come from and where she was going. Of course, he doesn't need to ask these questions. He knows who she is. He knows what has happened in the situation. But These questions are being asked in order for Hagar to reflect upon her own situation. And Hagar says that she is fleeing from her mistress Sarai. So the angel of the Lord then tells her to return and to submit to her mistress, even though that may mean further affliction and hardship for her. But submission to the will of God is necessary in order to put things right. But the call to submit is also accompanied by a promise to bless. The angel of the Lord promises that he will multiply Hagar's descendants so that they cannot be numbered. Verse 10 there, the angel of the Lord says to her, I will so greatly multiply your descendants that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And that's the same sort of promise that the Lord has given to Abraham as well, that his descendants will be like the stars in the heaven or like the sand on the seashore, impossible to number. And the same promise being made to Hagar here, that her descendants would be multiplied greatly, that they would not be could not be numbered. The angel of the Lord then confirms to her that she is with child, she's expecting a child, and she will give birth to a son, and he is to be given the name Ishmael. She is to call him Ishmael. So she doesn't choose the name. The angel of the Lord tells her what the name of the child will be, and the name Ishmael means God hears. The explanation is given there in verse 11. The angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. The Lord has heard, the Lord has given heed to what has happened to you. So it's this name would then always be a reminder to her of what had happened in this situation, and a reminder of God's interest in her and the grace that God had shown towards her, that God had paid attention to the affliction that she had suffered. So God hears. There will always be that reminder in the name Ishmael. Hagar is also told here something about the character of her son Ishmael, that he will be a wild ass of a man, his hand against every man and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. It's in verse 12 there. The wild ass was an animal that lived in the wilderness, and it survived under very harsh conditions. So this is an indication of Ishmael's character and the nomadic lifestyle that he would live, and the conflicts that he would be involved with. In the book of Job, in chapter 39, verses 5 to 8, there's a description there of the wild ass, and we get a sense here of what the character of Ishmael would be like, being likened to the wild ass. Job 39, verse 5. This is when God is questioning Job and asking him all these questions. He asks, who has let the wild ass go free? Who has loosed the bonds of the swift ass, to whom I have given the steppe for his home and the salt land for his dwelling place? He scorns the tumult of the city. He hears not the shouts of the driver. He ranges the mountains as his pasture, and he searches after every green thing. So the picture there is of the wild ass running free in the wilderness, that he doesn't dwell in cities. He's not under the control of someone driving him, but he has this freedom of running around in the wilderness. And that's the sort of character that is predicted here of Ishmael and his descendants, that they'd be like that wild ass, with having that nomadic lifestyle, rejecting a settled life within a city, but also being involved in these conflicts with others, that his hand will be against every man and every man's hand against him. And that would be fulfilled in the descendants of Ishmael. Hagar calls the Lord Yahweh, the one who spoke to her is Yahweh, and she calls him, thou art a God of seeing, she says in in verse 13. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "Thou art a God of seeing." The New International Version has "the God who sees me." The Hebrew name of God here is El Roi, the God who sees, the God of seeing. And because she says, "Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him?" There was the expectation, though, you couldn't see God and survive. And yet she says, "Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him?" So she gives him this name, the God of seeing, El Roi. Hagar was aware then that she had been in the presence of the Lord, that this angel of the Lord was none other than an appearance of God himself. She had seen God. And so to mark this great event, she gave the name Beer Lachairoi to the well where this had happened. This is where she had been found, and the well there is given this name. And we're given an explanation of the name here, that it means the well of one who sees and lives. So she had seen God, and yet she still lived. And we're given the location of this well as well in verse 14. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. Again, this is in the south, in the southern south of the Dead Sea, down in that the Negev area, the desert area to the south there. This was the region in which Isaac later would live as well, later on in chapter 24, verse 62. We're told there that Isaac had come from Beer Lahairoi and was dwelling in the Negev. And in chapter 25, verse 11, after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac dwelt at Beer Lahairoi. So that's the area where Isaac went and dwelt after the death of Abraham. So Hagar may have been one who was of a low status, a low social status. She's a maidservant. She's the property of Sarai. She belongs to Sarai. But we see here that God had treated her with great graciousness, treated her as a person who needed protection and encouragement, that God was watching over her. God had seen her. So we see God's concern here for the insignificant people who are like the Hagars of this world, people of low status. God still has an interest in them and is concerned for their well-being. So the final two verses of the chapter then, verses 15 and 16 says, "And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram." The chapter concludes then with the birth of Ishmael. Hagar then had obeyed the angel of the Lord. She had gone back. She'd returned to Sarai and to Abram. And she must have gone back with great reassurance, believing in this promise that God had made to her concerning Ishmael and the descendants of Ishmael. And eventually, she gave birth to a son, and it's Abram, we're told, who gave him the name Ishmael. And the fact that Abram named the child Ishmael would indicate that Hagar must have informed him of her meeting with the Lord and the blessings that had been promised. And Abram, we're told, is now 86 years old when Hagar gave birth to Ishmael. And it may have seemed up to that point that Ishmael was the one who would be, who was the fulfillment of this promise that God had made to Abram, that he would have a son and that descendants would come from him. They perhaps thought that this was the way in which God was going to fulfill that. But as we'll see in the next chapter, that is not to be the case. Today, the Arabs are the descendants from Ishmael as well. Okay, a few questions to think about at the end here then. How did Sarai's plan create family problems? Who was the angel of the Lord? What other references do we have to the angel of the Lord? What else can we learn about the angel of the Lord from the other places where he is mentioned? And how does God show his graciousness in this incident? So a few things to think about or to dwell upon from this chapter this evening. So we'll stop there, and if anyone has any thoughts or comments, then please